Our search to find college basketball's fiercest rivalry takes us to an obscure corner of western Michigan, where a more than 80-year-old dispute over religious doctrine drove a deep rift between two Division III schools and their basketball teams. Calvin versus Hope is number 4 on our list of fiercest rivalries.
And we welcome you to Calvin's Knollcrest Fieldhouse. It's going to be a wild one here tonight, the 104th meeting between these two MIAA rivals.
And really, I think, more than anything else, this is what the Hope-Calvin rivalry is about, Rick. Guys that are neighbors and friends playing against each other, not losing sight of what's at stake, playing hard, and then coming together as friends afterwards.
I'm Andy Fortier, a senior communication major at Hope College. Growing up in western Michigan, I've always been familiar with the Hope-Calvin rivalry. You see, I have a lot of family ties to both schools. My grandparents grew up in Holland and are diehard Hope fans. My aunt and uncle went to Hope in the 1980s. My cousins starred on the baseball field for Calvin. And my sister and I both currently attend Hope. I knew Hope and Calvin were rivals, but until I set foot on campus in the fall of 2014, I had no idea just how great it really was. My first Hope-Calvin game wasn't one to remember for the Dutchman. Hope lost by 20 and never really had a chance the entire game. What I do remember, however, were all of the fans packed into DeVos Fieldhouse that night. It was then when I truly understood what this game meant to the communities of Holland and Grand Rapids.
Growing up as a youngster, I was exposed to the Hope-Calvin game. I mean, my parents were graduates of Hope, my grandpa was, and they talked about the Hope-Calvin game all the time. And so it started when we moved here when I was a junior in high school, and then I went to the games. And then I came to Hope, and then since then it just has moved. You don't want to miss one, and it's so very, very exciting. And then I had the privilege to coach in 87 Hope-Calvin games, and that was just the best, absolutely the best.
Well, for me, my first exposure was my freshman year. And in the recruiting process, I didn't attend a Hope-Calvin game, so mine was kind of baptism by fire, and it was amazing. You know, you heard all about it building up to that week, that game, all kinds of hype with student ticket sales and you know, just more people attending practice than normal, I guess, and coach talking about it and veteran players talking about it. You really didn't have a clue how big it was until you actually show up in the arena and you see the energy, feel the energy. It was very unique, but awesome.
Yeah, I have a bit of a unique experience because I'm from the Grand Rapids area, and I also have a parent who was a faculty member here at Calvin growing up, and so I kind of grew up around the Calvin-Hope rivalry. I also went through the Grand Rapids Christian school system, and so it's kind of a natural thing to do on the weekend or thing to do during basketball season, particularly when you play yourself, to go to the basketball games at Calvin. And so, of course, you get told pretty early on about the Calvin-Hope rivalry. So I would say I was, elementary school to middle school when I first got really invested in it.
Well, when I first got the job, a lot of people said, do you know what you're getting into? Because I'm from Wisconsin, I'm not a Michigan guy, and I'm not a Calvin graduate. And I said, oh yeah, I've been a part of some big rivalries before, and when I came, I had no idea what I was getting into as far as how big of a rivalry it was. And my first game, we actually played at the new Van Andel Arena downtown, and it sold out 12,000 tickets before it had a chance to go to Ticketmaster. It was going to be sold in our team's box offices, and then after 2 weeks or whatever, it was going to go to Ticketmaster, and it never made it there. It sold out 12,000 seats. And at that time, Hope was really good, like Final Four, national championship caliber good. And I just remember being down 10 or 12 to nothing to start the game before we made it free. So I always say the good news is there was 12,000 people there, and the bad news, there was 12,000 people there. So I got a lot of suggestions after that game.
It was intense, but to me it was one-sided as a kid. It was Hope or nothing. I knew no Calvin folks. I knew nothing about Calvin, so it was pretty one-sided.
Well, I grew up what I would say is like in the heyday sort of it. So, like my high school was like Eric Elliott, Greg Mitchell, Wade Gugino, Steve Hondard from Calvin. I mean, that type of era. And I think I'm old, so you get a little bit spoiled and think, oh, those were the eras. But I mean, like in terms of like having like legit D1 prospects, I mean, like people that had NBA tryouts afterwards, you know, it was pretty amazing. Hoops, you know, and they were winning national championships, and Hope's #1 in the nation. I remember that stupid game at the Civic, you know, when they hit a shot at the buzzer to beat Hope, when, you know, Hope was, you know, #1 in the nation or something like that. And just, you know, those kind of things, the back and forth, the energy back in the day of the Civic being just kind of crazy. The old days of Knollcrest at Calvin. So, I mean, those were really sort of my memories growing up and kind of experiencing, I would always say, like basketball at its best.
And Hope had a tremendous team in 1991. I think they were ranked #2 in the country. Had a big center who was just tremendous, Wade Gugino. Kali Carlson, who is the assistant coach for the Hope women's basketball team. He was a tremendous player. Eric Elliott, All-American point guard, another tremendous player. And they had a bunch of other players that were quote-unquote role players, but, you know, could have been stars on any other team. Bart Verhulst, for instance, comes to mind. Folks like Doug Meskar was really good. Just a lot of really, really talented Hope teams. And then on the same token, Calvin had its All-Americans. Steve Hondard, who was named the Player of the Decade by Division III News for the decade of the 1990s. And the all-time leading scorer at Calvin. He scored 61 points in one game, not against Hope, but in an MIAA game against Kalamazoo. Bill Saul, who was a two-time All-American. Dan Davis, two-time All-American. So there were All-American players on both sides of the coin when I started covering it as a student newspaper person, and as a student television person. So the level of competition was at a really high level, and that continued on as I became a sports information director. Hope went to the national championship game twice in the 1990s. Joel Holsteg was a huge part of that. They had some other great players too. Dan Van Hecken comes to mind. Dave Muhlenberg was a tremendous player. And Hope kind of took control there in the mid to the late 90s, and then Calvin in 2000 breaks through and wins the national championship with a couple All-Americans and Jeremy Veenster and Aaron Winkle. And then throughout the 2000s, and really since then, it's kind of been this back and forth.
What I found most interesting during my research was how close the series between the two teams actually was. After almost 100 years and 196 games, Hope leads the series 101-95. And the two teams are separated by just 84 points all time, which averages out to only 0.43 points per game. But it can't just be the statistics that make this rivalry great. So I got together with my classmates, Steve and Kevin, and we set out to find what makes this rivalry one of the best in the country.
I mean, pastors talk about it from the pulpit. Mothers and dads talk about it with grandpas and grandmas. Parents, families talk about it with what they have at their house, and the marriages have a Calvin person marrying a Hope person, and you've got all these dynamics that go on that you have to sort of work through.
I mean, I think like it's sort of like an ironic joke that you'd say like religion makes it so special, but I think like just like the tension between like the RCA and the CRC, and then you've got mainly CRC people at Calvin and you've got RCA people at Hope, and but we all know each other, right? So like everybody's in the same community. I think it's interesting nowadays because some of that's changed. But I think, back, in the 80s, 70s, 80s, even I think in the 90s, that was really like the connection.
The fact that it's very close in proximity geographically, I think the two schools are roughly 27 to 30 miles apart. So it has a little bit of a Duke, North Carolina feel where two conference rivals that are competing for conference championships that are located very close together. A lot of alumni that are very close in proximity, that know each other, live around each other, and that type of thing. And both teams have been very successful at a national level. Calvin's won a couple of national championships. Hope's been to the championship game a handful of times and been to the Final Four a handful of times. So the fact that both teams have been very successful at a national level as well, I think all of those things combine into making this a really great rivalry.
From the outside looking in, going to Alma obviously had a unique perspective, and I think that the schools are a lot more similar than they like to give recognition for. They're, from an Alma standpoint, they're pretty much mirror images of each other. Hope and Calvin, from like the faith, the standpoint, the type of recruits that they get as players, the coaches, the morals that they're trying to instill as a community. I'd say as a whole, they're very much the same. But they're just, one's Grand Rapids, one's Holland, so that similarity, I think, adds to the rivalry too.
Yeah, and I think if you compare it to other rivalries like Michigan and Ohio State or Duke and North Carolina, it's just once you establish that tradition, and once it's set in stone, it's there and it's present, and it's not going anywhere. So,
and both schools have good programs. So in the early 80s, when I played, Calvin was down, and we never lost to Calvin. So it seemed like it was less of a big deal than when it's real competitive. So I think it goes also to the point that they're both very good programs.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors, the closeness of the schools, but I think the closeness of the players. We've had teammates who have played on opposite sides. I've had students who have been in my Sunday school class at church who are in the Hope crowd, student section, that are cheering against us when we play, and guys who've played in 3-on-3 tournaments together or AAU together, and now they're on the opposite side. And so even though it's an intense rivalry from a wanting to win standpoint, there's a lot of respect and a lot of care and heartfelt appreciation for the opponents at the same time.
Special rivalry locally because so many people are involved in it. So many people that have historical roots here in Holland and Grand Rapids care about this or have at least taken a side. That's the interesting about sports and rivalries, is that it tends to polarize people a little bit. You choose one or the other, Michigan or Ohio State or Calvin. And so a lot of people have a vested interest in that sense, going to Reformed churches, Christian Reformed churches.
Yeah, I think that it took me a little while to really grasp how fortunate we are to have this type of a rivalry right here in West Michigan, because I grew up with it. And so I kind of thought I'm sure a bunch of other places have small ball rivalries similar to this. But then as I grew up, I was told over and over again, there's really nothing like this across the country in small ball, basketball, or any other sport. And so, as I began to learn that dynamic, I was like, well, that's really interesting that this many people are invested in this, and that it has such a long history, and that there's a really cool narrative on both sides.
I mean, it's so intense and so passionate and so traditional, and has so much tradition with it, which you don't get, like I said, at the D3 level. You have your Kentucky Dukes or your Duke North Carolinas and stuff like that, but you don't see it with smaller colleges at all on the national level, besides a Hope and Calvin, and then we're always traditionally, both programs are traditionally so good that like it's always a good game, regardless if one program feels like they're down one year. Like it's a rivalry game, so literally anything can happen. And I think there's been so many games where anything has happened in the games that like it makes for like a storybook ending every time, pretty much. So.
Well, I've been a part of an awful lot of them, you know, so there's always game winners and, you know, on both sides and that kind of thing. So I remember a lot of those. You know, I think I lost the first 4 games that I coached against Hope, and so the first one was pretty sweet here in the Calvin Fieldhouse. There was a game that Aaron Winkle hit a 35-footer to send the game into overtime, which we won. Caleb Veldhouse made a shot as a freshman, a step back 3 at the buzzer to win the game, and but we've also had some tough losses as well.
We focus on everything. I can't say that I have a moment, but I think what I remember the most collectively is just the noise and the vibe, the pulse. You know, not being able to hear the ball bounce on the floor is something I remember as a player, or not being able to hear whistles right away. You know, it's that deafening and that exciting. So, yeah, just that hoopla and noise of the game is probably something that most resonates with me as a player, for sure.
Play it like any other game, and you got to compete. It's the adrenaline's going to flow when the fans start screaming. But and it'll be bigger than the other games in that regard. From a parent standpoint, I'll probably be more nervous than other games because I don't like losing to Calvin. So.
Yeah, like he said, it's just like any other game with preparation. But I'm just kind of excited to play in that environment. Like, not that many people get to play in that kind of environment at the D3 level. So, yeah, I'm just excited to go out there and do it.
Well, I'll try to keep it somewhat balanced here because, you know, some of my favorite ones are ones where it was a Calvin victory. But I would think one that comes to mind just from me as a sports information director was a game that Hope actually won 70-56. 1997, the Calvin home game was moved to downtown Grand Rapids at Van Andel Arena, and it set a Division III single game attendance record of 11,442 fans. And I remember that because I have repeated that many a time.
We had built up a losing streak of like 20 games in a row we lost to Calvin. I'm talking about ruining a rivalry. 20 games in a row we had lost to Calvin. And then I became the head coach, and I think 2 or 3 of my first coaching experience against Calvin coaching, we lost. So we had a losing streak of about 23 games. And we got good. I mean, the team got good. Recruiting took place. We got some really good kids, some really young kids, kids with a lot of enthusiasm. And in the Civic Center on this particular day, February 6, 1980, Hope 65, Calvin 57. The floor in the Civic Center has never been filled by people more than the first 30 seconds after that game finished. This moment in time, we made a t-shirt the next day that said, "The Day of the Dutchman," and they went like hotcakes. Everyone wanted to get one. The Day of the Dutchman was February 6, 1980, and that was Hope 65 and Calvin 57. Man, I can remember the guys that played. I can remember full court pressing. I can remember the steals. I can remember the baskets. But above all, I can remember the final score. It just was a great feeling at that point. And from that point, we went on. The year after that, we won, I think, 5 championships in a row. So that was a good start for us to get going.
A funny thing was like 2010 or so, we were playing at Hope, and John Mantell was our center and our best player, very good player, but a little goofy himself, you know, kind of. And at the end of the game, we were ahead, and he was shooting some free throws, and a kid from Hope came out and ripped off his sweats and had nothing but a Speedo on. And it was perfect that it was John, because afterwards he said, I thought, God, I better make these free throws because there's a naked guy standing under the hoop. That's probably as far over the line as it's gotten, I would say.
Yeah, well, the ironic piece that maybe you don't even know is, so the only time I played in the rivalry, I actually played for Calvin. So like, and I played only JV, but then I got pulled up to the varsity, and I actually scored 2 points against Hope as a freshman in the national tournament because Calvin had blown out Hope for something, and that was like, you know, the year of Honderd and those guys when they were winning the national championship. And so like kind of an interesting twist, I think, to it. Maybe just a sad twist for me that I said I played at Calvin.
Right now, one of the other things I want to do is I want to do something unique for the Hope Calvin game. So I decided that I would. We have a little 10-acre piece, and we had every animal you can imagine. I'm going to grow some turkeys, and then I'm going to eat a turkey, butcher it, before the night of the home Calvin game, which always would be a Saturday or a Wednesday. So I'd grow these turkeys, and then I would name them Calvin. And I'd grow them as little chicks, and I'd feed them organic food, and then they'd get to be huge. They couldn't even walk, they'd get so heavy. And so I had one that was 50 plus pounds before it dressed. I mean, they were humongous. But then I would invite the players that would want to come out to clean Calvin, and then we'd eat it the next night. We'd eat it that night, and the next day we'd play the game. So it was awesome because the captains always had the first cut. They stood on either side of the turkey, 2 or 3 or 1 or whatever, usually 2 or 3. And they would all have a big knife, and the players would be behind them, and they'd carve up Calvin, and we'd eat it, and we would have more laugh over eating Calvin. And so we did that for years and years and years. We'd do it. It was always, Coach, how big's the turkey this year? What color is it? When are we going to clean it? Can we get it down to the gym sometime? I mean, it got to be a really pretty cool thing.
A couple games that stick out to me that went right down to the wire. My favorite game would probably be the 1990 regular season finale. The teams met 3 times that year, and Calvin actually won all 3. Both teams were in the top 10 throughout the year. And the regular season finale, Hope was a game behind Calvin. If it could have won, would have gotten a share of the league championship. And it was a very close game, back and forth. Both teams were exceedingly strong. And a very good friend of mine who I'd grown up with since we were in kindergarten, by the name of Todd Hennick, hit about a 28-footer at the buzzer. Well, they actually put a second back on the clock, but it was a deep 3 with a defender in his face. In fact, a defender who he had gone to high school with. And Calvin ended up winning that one by 3. And then a week later, they played in the NCAA tournament. Calvin won that by double digits. But that was a pretty unique moment.
Of all the Hope Calvin games I've witnessed over the last few years, the MIAA championship game at Calvin my freshman year continues to be the one game I remember above all the rest. The atmosphere was electric, emotions ran high, it ended in a 1-point game, and to top it off, it ended in controversy.
I have a ton of memories that are like, I'll never forget that, and it has to do with the Calvin Hope game or rivalry. But I think that there's one that's kind of the leading obvious answer. I was involved in the conference championship game. I forget what the year was, but Jordan Brink was a senior, and we had beaten Hope twice in the regular season, but they had us on our heels in the championship game. We were down the entire game until like the last minute of the game, and I happened to be involved in the play where we took the lead. And I always tell Jordan that that's the happiest I've been of a bad pass, because those of you who know the reference, Jordan Brink was kind of going to take his man one-on-one. He got doubled, and he threw a terrible pass kind of out of desperation to me. And if it would have been a good pass, I was going to take the shot and try to take the lead, but he threw a terrible pass, so I had to like go over my head and grab it. And at that point, the defense had recovered, so I threw it back to our best player, and he stepped up and hit it like we all kind of knew he would if he got a good look. And so that was just crazy, because we had to go from such emotion for feeling like, wow, we might win this, but there was still some time on the clocks. We had to play defense. Coach put me out there kind of like a free safety, and he was like, they're going to have to throw this long. You're going to stand in the middle of the court and just try to bat it out of the way, which I did. And fortunately, we ended up on top. And, you know, there was controversy behind it, but it was pretty surreal to have all of the fans kind of, you know, come out on the floor and rush the floor and stuff like that. And I just kind of think that that was the epitome of the emotion and the hype that goes into that game.
You know, so when I watched that, my first thought is Ben Gardner, because he was in a real tough situation. And then you see, I think it was Cody that got to him first, and you know, knew right away that this could get a little bit ugly. So you know, when I see that, I just think of Ben, and you know, Ben was actually kind of yelling for help at the bottom of the pile, and it was chaotic and stressful. And credit to both students for it not getting out of hand, because it certainly could have. So that's what I think about when I see that moment. As far as the game itself, really well played game. Credit to George for hitting a big shot. You know, for us, it was the difference between getting into the national tournament and not. And again, at that point of the season, I thought we were playing our best basketball and really could have perhaps made a run. And you know, the basketball gods didn't allow it to happen. So for me, all it really just reminds me of is how you have to maximize your opportunities. In the rivalry game, it just goes up another notch. So tough to watch, but it definitely impacted our off season and how we went into the next season, and how focused and driven our guys were, because they didn't forget that moment. I did a great job of not letting them forget that moment. I'll be completely honest, not to be you know, self-serving here, but it was a big deal for us and really kind of fortified the next season. So yeah, one that's permanently emblazoned on the memory bank for sure.
That's a tough one, because storming the court is kind of part of big-time college athletics. You know, I mean, it happens in a variety of sports, and we've certainly had it happen on the other side when the Hope crowd has stormed the court, you know, kind of a thing. So from that point, it's really an enthusiastic, really exciting and fun part. Obviously, it's unfortunate that Ben was down on the sideline, and the emotion of that loss was kind of crushing for him at that moment. I know one of our guys, when I walked by, was reaching down trying to help him up, and he didn't want to get up. And then our guys were kind of all around, and it was unfortunate. Certainly, I'm glad he didn't get hurt, and you know, those types of things. But the emotions run pretty high, and to win it, you know, having trailed for 39 minutes and 50 seconds in that game, it's unfortunate, because honestly that year we were the better team. We had won the 2 games prior to that, but when you play a team a third time, especially a rival, it's just so difficult, and it was just kind of a slugfest, and neither team shot well, and we kind of grinded it out and got to a point where we had a chance to win, and Jordan is about as clutch a shooter as we've had, and so it was pretty exciting for us that we won in that fashion.
That definitely, I mean, that just kind of added to the fire a little bit. It was nice for me as like a freshman to see that, that was our freshman year. So as a freshman to see that, like, that was like, wow, like this thing's for real. Like this stirs up a lot of emotions in people, to see that in Ben and from their fans, and to see that out of Corey McMahon and stuff too. And just the way like our teammates handled that, that definitely stuck with us through that rest of the year.
I think my thought process, because if you know the context and you watch the video, it wasn't just the Hope guys who were at risk of being kind of throttled. You know, that we had Calvin guys who had gotten taken out as well and who were on the ground. And so I remember pretty vividly our assistant coaches, we're like exuberant and like excited and trying to like celebrate, but I remember our assistant coaches kind of coming out and like clearing students off of not just Hope players but also our players, because we had a couple who just kind of got tackled out of excitement as well. So I remember thinking, oh shoot, I wonder who's under this pile. I hope that our guys are good. Not that I wasn't thinking about the Hope guys, but immediately my mind went to, I hope our guys aren't getting tackled under here. And then afterward, when it became clear that it seemed disrespectful and perhaps Ben got hurt underneath there, I definitely felt bad. But I also at the same time recognized I don't think any Calvin students were ill-intentioned, and were we at Hope, a similar thing probably would have happened, and it could have easily have been us had we lost the game that was getting trampled underneath there. You know what I'm saying? And fortunately, injuries weren't as bad as they could have been even. And I think that as controversial as that was and as potentially dangerous as that was, it's what goes into a rivalry like this, like it's what makes it what it is because people were so into the game, the fans were so into it and invested in the game that now we have another addition to the narrative. Like we have another pinpoint in the history of Calvin Hope rivalry that people won't forget and that people can comment on, and everyone goes, yep, I remember that was this year and that was this player. And every rivalry has to have a history with key events in it, and that's probably an addition to the history of this rivalry. And I'm glad and feel fortunate that no one got hurt worse than what did happen. So.
Through all the great players, coaches, games, moments, and even controversy, one thing has stood out to me throughout this entire process, and it's that the rivalry is special because of the people involved. We love it, and it's ours, and nobody can take that away from us.
I love this game because just because of the fire of the game. If you're on fire, everybody wants to come and watch you burn. I love that quote. If you're on fire, everybody wants to come and watch you burn. I love to watch students get excited for a Hope Calvin game. I love it when we win. I love it when we don't. But I just love it.
The longtime sports information director at Hope, Tom Renner, would always repeat is that the definition of an atheist is someone who doesn't care who wins the Calvin Hope Calvin basketball game. And I guess what I take out of that is that it's not just a game, it's a talking point throughout the next 300 and some days, or the next few weeks after you've had the first game and then the second game. It doesn't matter at what point of the year it is. It could be the dead of summer. You could bump into somebody at a cottage or the beach or up north or in Italy or wherever. It's a talking point. So it's one of those rivalries that is just part of everybody's life here in West Michigan in particular, but for anybody who's got a vested interest in the rivalry, it's going to be a talking point probably for the rest of their lives.
Well, I think rivalry is a unique thing for us to think about as Christians who engage in sport. The fact that sport is based on competition. Sport is based on trying to win something that therefore means that your opponent does not win. So it's an attempt to gain something that someone else then cannot have. It seems a little bit antithetical to our Christian faith. And yet you come to these games, the Hope Calvin games, and you see 3,500 people who on a Saturday afternoon are about less than 24 hours from all going to church and all passing the communion plate together. So it's a unique mixture of this relationship between our faith and our intensely competitive athletics. In some sense that seems incompatible, and I think in some ways it is. However, I argue in this rivalry article that really the seeds of rivalry are the fact that lead us into temptation at times, but it doesn't mean that sport's inherently evil or sinful. And so we can compete intensely against Calvin, against our rivals, and want to win very badly. But we also need to make sure that that's relegated below our feelings of love towards our God and Savior, knowing that when we enter the stadium, we need to keep that in mind, that we are first and foremost God's children. Then we can come in, I think, a healthier relationship towards our opponents.
Well, I think probably the big thing is the respect factor, and it's I've had the chance to coach against 3 different coaches now at Hope, and just have a lot of respect for Coach Mitchell. And when you're looking at Louisville, Kentucky, and some things like that are just so hate-filled, that believe me, no one wants to beat Calvin more than Hope, and no one wants to beat Hope more than Calvin. But it's not that type of relationship, I don't think. It's certainly not from the teams and coaches' standpoint, and I really think the fans have more good-natured fun with it than anything really awful. And I sure hope that continues, because it's a pretty special part of these two places to be a part of those games.
Well, I think it's pretty unique. You know, we all go to college for different reasons. I mean, I think in the recruiting process we talk about Hope being just an awesome academic institution with incredible professors and obviously great facilities, a great location. And as an athlete, as a basketball player, hopefully you factor in all those things when you make your college decision. But I think each of us who have had the privilege to play for Hope, part of the reason we came to Hope was because of that game. I mean, in all honesty, it does mean that much. And if you're a basketball player, there's nothing like being in a sold-out venue at Calvin or at Hope and being a part of that game. So as a player, as a coach, shoot, I'm doubly fortunate to be in that situation, and I still get to experience that 2, if not 3 times a year. So yeah, it's pretty awesome, and definitely is something I look forward to every single year.
But I think the uniqueness about this rivalry is that it's so central to a number of elements of rivalry. So people across the nation, I think, can learn from the fact that we have such a close relationship. And really, when we see rivalry in our lives, and in sports specifically, so much of it has to do with the fact that we are so similar. It's not about our differences, it's about our similarities. Hope and Calvin are like siblings. And so our schools are much more similar than they are different. And so in that sense, our rivalry is different from, say, even a Duke, North Carolina, that tends to attract different types of students. We attract similar students. Michigan, Ohio State, which are both good teams, but they're different geographically in some sense. We're very similar geographically. And so I think there's a lot of similarities that show that we're maybe the best exemplar of a rivalry.